Hello everyone and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. The last video I did was a continuation of Peter Brown's book, The Love You Make. The main theme of the last video was drug trips and regular trips by the Beatles and by their manager Brian Epstein. I'm anxious to find out what happens next, so let's go see now. Brian lost his father in July. He had a heart attack. Brian was there for his mother Queenie. She was very depressed, as would be expected. He begged her to go to London to live. He told her why would she want to live in Liverpool. He told her he could find her a flat near his house and they could decorate it. He said, "We'll have the best time." Queenie hugged him and cried, and she said, "I need you, Brian. I do so need you." And Brian said to her, Now, mother, I need you more than you could ever need me." Queenie for a time lived with Brian, and he started doing better. She woke him each morning, opening up the drapes, and let the sun in. He showered and dressed, and they ate breakfast together, and they went over plans for the day. He went to work each day. At night, he took his mother to the theater or a restaurant, and he hid his barbiturates, and he didn't let it interfere with his work or his sleep. During this time, John, Paul, and George were on their way to the Park Lane Hilton Hotel to hear the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi speak. Pattie Harrison had told them about it. She had been introduced to transcendental meditation as a way to get high on her first trip to India with George. During this time, George had loved Indian music and food, but the religious part of it he hadn't grasped yet. Pattie taught herself mysticism and transcendental meditation from books. In February, she surprised George by enrolling in the spiritual regeneration movement. She attended once a week without George, and she told George she had been indoctrinated and given a mantra, a secret word to chant, and George felt left out. He told her, "What kind of scene is this if they make you keep secrets from your friends?" The next day they went to see the Maharishi. Ringo didn't go because he was at Queen Charlotte's Hospital visiting Maureen, who was his wife, and his newborn son, Jason. When the Beatles got to the Hilton, they were shown to the front row of the ballroom. There were 1,000 people there. The Maharishi spoke about Jesus, Buddha. He spoke about God, of eternal happiness and peace, of inner self and sublime consciousness, about reaching a state of nirvana, all without messy and illegal drugs. He was preaching transcendental meditation. You practice it twice a day, and it would make you a happier and better person. This was just the surface of ancient Hindu practice, but the Beatles were looking for that. The Maharishi went into a deep trance-like state for 10 minutes in front of everyone, and John was swept away by it all. He thought he'd found the answer, the next big thing. The Maharishi was a college graduate with a degree in physics. After college, he learned Sanskrit and studied scriptures. After that, he moved to various Western countries, telling them about salvation. The Maharishi invited them to his suite for a private audience with him. He told the Beatles, "You've created a magic air through your names. You got to use that magic influence. Yours is a tremendous responsibility." He invited the Beatles to a 10-day meditation course, and the Maharishi was giving that in Bangor, North Wales, at Normal College. They would leave with 300 other people who signed up, and they were to travel on a public train from Euston Station. When they left, it was a banking holiday, so everything was crowded. The film crew and reporters were there to get a glimpse of the Beatles. Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull were also going to go with the Beatles. It was decided that Neil would make sure that they got on the train without trouble. And John and Cynthia were driven to the station in his Rolls Royce, which probably was a bad idea because the fans recognized it. And the crowds were gathering around them, and John just pushed his way through, pretending to be a person on vacation. Flashbulbs went off, and Cynthia was temporarily blinded. She lost John and went to the wrong platform. John got on the train, and then he realized Cynthia wasn't with him. He saw her on the platform, and the police were holding her back from the other fans. And John shouted to Cynthia, "Tell them to let you go on. Tell them you're with us." Cynthia cried and finally broke free and raced after the train. John shouted, "Run, Cynthia, run!" But she was unable to catch up to the train. Neil, he agreed to drive her to Bangor, and she would probably get there before the train did. Cynthia at that time knew she wasn't crying about not getting on the train. She wrote in her memories, "As I watched all the people that I loved fading into the hazy distance, that was to be my future. The loneliness I felt on that station platform would become a permanent loneliness before very long, and I shivered at the thought. Bangor, North Wales was a seaside town with rolling green hills that met the water. The Beatles and all those who signed up were put in dormitories. They had dinner that evening at a local Chinese restaurant. Then the Beatles realized they didn't have the money to pay the bill. They were like the royal family. They didn't carry cash. George Harrison saved the day by saying he had a 10-pound note in between the layers of one of his sandals. He pried open the false seal with a table knife, and that covered the check. Thank goodness. Impossible to achieve spiritual harmony with foreign substances in one system. John kept his promise for a few days at least. Brian, though, he hadn't given up on drugs. The Beatles had asked him to join them on the trip, thinking it would do him good, but they knew he wouldn't go with them. Brian was going to spend time with Peter and Jeffrey Ellis at Kingsley Hill. When Brian got there, he was in a dark mood. The other house guests had called to cancel, and Brian faced the prospect of spending the holiday with two old chums. Well, that doesn't sound such a bad thing. I don't know why he was upset about it. They had a quiet meal of roasted pork and many bottles of wine. Brian started to call around London to find amusing company to go to Kingsley Hill. By then, everybody had made their plans, so they had made plans in town or they were gone out of town. Brian told Jeffrey and Peter he was going to drive around the countryside and come back. But by midnight, he was still gone, so Peter called Brian's private line at Chapel Street. Antonio, the butler, answered. He said that Brian had come in and went to bed. So Peter said, let Brian sleep, and they let him sleep all the next day. At 5 in the afternoon, Brian called Kingsley Hill. He had just woken up and was groggy. He said he was going to have some breakfast, read the mail, and watch Jukebox Jury before driving back to Kingsley Hill. Peter said he should take the train since he was still groggy, and Brian agreed it was a better idea. He said he would call later on to say what train he was going to be arriving on. He never called. Sunday that noon, Antonio and his wife tried to rouse Brian on the house intercom. They tried calling Peter and Jeffrey, but they didn't answer. They'd gone to a local pub. Antonio called Brian's secretary, Joanne Newfield, and she called Alistair Taylor and asked him to meet her at Chapel Street. When they got there, they called Peter, who was back at Kingsley Hill. He told them not to call his personal physician, Dr. John Galway, and he lived 2 blocks away. 15 minutes later, the doctor got to Brian's, and they were all waiting outside the locked double oak doors to Brian's bedroom. Dr. Galway asked Peter what to do. Peter told him to break down the door. Peter remained on the phone as he listened to Antonio and Brian Barrett hit the double oak doors. In the room, the curtains were drawn, and the room was dark. Brian was lying on his right side, his legs curled up in a fetal position. Saturday's mail was open on the bed next to him, and everyone in the room knew that he was dead. But his secretary said, "It's all right. He's just asleep. He's fine." Jeffrey Ellis called Clive, Brian's brother, and Clive said, "It's a lie. You're lying." And crying, Clive drove to his mother's house. Queenie collapsed when he told her, and she had to be put under sedation. She got herself together and flew to London to be with her son. The Beatles were in Wales, and a payphone rang. Jane Asher answered the phone. She said, "Bring Paul to the phone." Peter told him that Brian was dead. He said the press were in on it and they needed to come back to London. Paul and the others were shocked and sedate and confused. The Maharishi said that Brian's death was a good thing and not to be mourned. He told them to laugh because laughter would clear the bad karma and help Brian's spirit on his journey. John told the press that meditation had given us the confidence to withstand such a shock, even though they'd only been meditating for 2 days. Paul was wooden. He said it was a great shock and that he was very upset. George said there was no such thing as death, only in a physical sense. He told a group of reporters, "We know he's okay now. He will return because he's striving for happiness and desire bliss so much." Days after the shock wore off, the Beatles started to make foolish jokes about him. So I don't agree about doing stuff like that, but I guess that was how they dealt with their grief. So Robert Stigwood was on a yacht, and he had rented it for the Bee Gees. They were celebrating the end of the work for their first album. An assistant went to a phone box and came back saying, "Brian's dead, Brian's dead." Stigwood thought at that moment that NEMS and the Beatles were his. In New York, Alan Klein in New York City, Alan Klein heard the news of Brian's death on the car radio. He snapped his fingers and said, "I got him." The coroner said Brian died from an accidental overdose of carbitol. He was given a dignified funeral in Liverpool. The Beatles were asked to stay away so it wouldn't turn into a media circus. He was buried at Long Lane Jewish Cemetery, not far from his father's grave. Queenie never seemed to get over it. She spent many years in a psychiatric treatment and blamed herself for his death. Nat Weiss flew in from New York and tossed a sunflower given to him by George Harrison into his open grave. Nat Weiss sat in the chapel and wept bitterly. Brian was a man whose passions had sparked an entertainment phenomenon, but the world would only remember his unhappiness, not all of the successes he had. Later they found the suicide note that he had kept from that one time earlier in a will, and they didn't tell anyone about it. It was a secret shared by Clive, Queenie, and Peter. He willed all his holdings to his family. Queenie and Clive made sure that his other wishes were kept. Jeffrey Ellis and Peter were given cash gifts, and along with Nat Weiss and each of the Beatles, they got to choose something from Brian's possessions. Clive had to start selling off Brian's personal holdings to pay the estate taxes. He got rid of the lease on the Seville. He sold the silver Bentley, the house in the country, the furniture, and the crystal chandeliers. Chapel Street house was sold last. At NEMS there was a power struggle. The old guard, Peter, Jeffrey, and Neil, along with others, and then the newer partners were Stigwood and Shaw. Peter was handling the Beatles' personal management, and he was distressed by doing this. Other employees thought he was trying to step into Brian's shoes, but Peter said he was doing what he had to do simply because there was no one else who knew how to do it. Stigwood and Shaw insisted that Brian's death shouldn't interfere with their option to buy NEMS. So Clive called a meeting of the board of directors at NEMS, hoping to block Shaw and Stigwood from taking over. Stigwood and Shaw had a problem. It was to convince the Beatles to stay with them. But Stigwood hardly knew them. The Beatles were shocked when they found out that Brian had planned to sell NEMS. As far as the Beatles were concerned, Brian's option with Stigwood didn't include them. Stigwood and Shaw were claiming otherwise, and they met with them, the Beatles did, to set Stigwood and Shaw straight. Paul said, "We aren't about to be sold like some sort of chattel. Not to Robert Stigwood, not to the Queen Mum." Clive Epstein intervened diplomatically, and Stigwood and Shaw had a quick exit, and it was negotiated. They would stay with the company until they were able to raise enough money to start their new company, the Robert Stigwood Organization. Stigwood wanted a severance package from NEMS, and he was paid £25,000 to get out of the company quietly. He took his office furniture, and he took the Bee Gees. Paul McCartney had said that no one could replace Brian. Then he started to take over the reins. He came up with the Magical Mystery Tour film. He said it would be an hour-long special for TV. I did a couple of videos of the Magical Mystery Tour 2 years ago, one for the album and one for the movie, so I'm not going to go into many details about it here. So check out the videos if you want to see more. Peter said that the Magical Mystery Tour was a mess, and that if Brian had been alive, it never would have happened the way it did. Critics and the viewers didn't like it, and Paul ended up apologizing. The movie, though, ended up making $2 million from rentals to colleges. In America, the Magical Mystery Tour album grossed $8 million in its first 10 days of release. In England, where the Magical Mystery Tour was released as an EP, it also hit the #1 spot. Whatever they touched turned to money. The question now was, would they continue to make money with Brian gone? In this episode, we had Brian lose his father, and he tried to help his mother by easing off the drugs a bit. But Queenie couldn't be with him 24/7, and he was his own worst enemy at times. I don't think he meant to kill himself. He just needed more drugs to help him feel good, and he took a few too many. The Beatles at this time were trying to find a way to feel enlightened without drugs, and Pattie led them to the Maharishi. They were at a college course for a 10-day training to become enlightened when they found out Brian died. The Maharishi tried to explain it was good news and that they, in turn, had to tell the press that, but the Beatles were also sad and confused about what the future would bring without him. The vultures, of course, came out after Brian's death, and people were trying to take over the business. Luckily, Brian had a will, and he had things set on who would get what. Stigwood and Shaw were bought out of the business and got a severance package, and Stigwood had the Bee Gees, so they made out pretty well on that deal. It was sad that Brian couldn't get himself together. He was too young to die, and he could have kept the Beatles together for a much longer time if he had lived. I will continue on with the book and see where it leads us in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope that everybody's been having a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye. call Brian's doctor because he was too far away.